Totally. I love your question about lead time on pivot because I think that is one of the biggest cost fallacies of product in, a loving critique of that whole experience, right? Because, or what do we mean when we bring up the MVP? And I think that's why you see so many people writing articles and, talking about it, because like, what is the real MVP? And it's like, well, it's because everybody's had like 5,000 different experiences, depending on who they talk to, about what that definition is. Most people that manage you really want you to say yes. Whereas like I've noticed in engineering managers typically, it comes from, and this like almost goes back to like really what I've been thinking about a lot. Like engineers have to think very practically, how is this going to get done?
Well, we're going to hit it straight off. Welcome everyone to another Modus Operandi podcast with Noelle, Lansford. I wish we had an audience. Like,
Right. Let's put it in there. Like,
hey.
oh my goodness.
Oh, one day.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Noelle, we have a great subject, and I want to start it from the top. I want to take actually your subject first.
Okay. All right.
I really want to get why development and designers have so much issues in not communication per se, but in collaboration and in handoffs.
Yes.
There's always some form of issues, no matter. And I'm saying this from a design ops, being a design ops expert.
Yeah.
Handoffs is one of the key things we always try to fix when we come and help companies. Yes. But why is it always broken in any company that we've seen? Why do you think it's always like that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. There could be a lot, and every team's different, and I'm sure you've run into that, and you probably have a million stories of all the different ways that it could possibly be different at a different company, right? A lot of it has to do with team culture, and I end up talking about team culture a lot because of that handoff space that I'm really passionate about. And I've kind of been trying to dig a little bit deeper into this as I've been thinking about it, of like, okay, but like, what are the fundamental differences in the ways that a developer thinks and the way that a designer thinks? And like, how are they approaching problems, and what is their overall process? And you and I've kind of talked about this a bit on one of our earlier episodes, of kind of being the designer that's trying to fit their way into the developer space, and maybe getting some resistance from that, just like more from a company culture or a team culture perspective. But I would say even from a process perspective, right? Like, the amount of tools that a developer uses in their workflow is usually higher than the amount of tools that a designer uses. And that doesn't mean that, one is better or whatever, or, you have to be, super smart to understand all the tools. But it's just a lot more jumping around and a lot more context switching for developers than it is for a designer, who is generally going to be really locked into that user flow and thinking about it for very strategically and more broad before then narrowing it down to that handoff. So sometimes that context switch of like, okay, but then there's this tool and that dependency and whatever, that becomes a very confusing conversation, because the handoff is in the middle of an already set development process. And now there's this communication barrier of where the developer's at in the process and where the designer's at in the process. And they're just kind of clashing.
Yeah. But then okay, let me dissect what you just mentioned. There's always context switching between the tools. Now, do you think, I'm going to play it on both sides. First, I'm going to start with the development side. Do you think developers come in to companies, or they join companies, and they can't deal with the fact of using different context or different tools for handovers, for collaboration, and it causes a lot of issues? And before you answer, I'll give you my 2 cents in it. One of the key issues that I see, or that we try and fix, is onboarding.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you onboard a developer, or when you onboard a designer, or when you onboard people in the team, a lot of companies fail in that onboarding process
Yeah.
because time, they're kind of just thrown in the deep end. So they don't really get to show, okay, this is our way of working. This is the process. This is where the designers hand over stuff. This is the documentation. And they come in and go, oh, but I've been doing this in my company like XYZ. And it causes a lot of issues when new developers come in. Now, what's your take on what I just mentioned?
Yeah, I love that you brought up onboarding. Yes. Yes to all of that. It's just so overlooked, and I think I've noticed it especially happens on design ops or like design systems teams, because generally those teams go straight for a senior hire, and the expectation of like a senior and up hire is that minimal onboarding should be necessary. Like I've noticed that hiring trend a lot lately in the last 3-ish years for design systems teams. And because of that, I think it's kind of like you get a list of files maybe, or a list of things and maybe like a walkthrough, but then it's like, okay, jump in, and that's not,
Yeah.
uh, you know, I think there's a little bit more to it than that, of like, if your team actually even has a formalized process to introduce somebody to an onboarding, or if it's all just kind of this innate knowledge that the team's fallen into and they've never actually recognized it as something unique to their company. It's just like, oh yeah, we do it this way. Or maybe I've even seen companies that maybe have a little bit of like embarrassment about the way that
Yeah.
they do those things. And so then they definitely don't formalize it. They're just like, hey, this is less than ideal, but this is kind of how we do it. And I'm like, might as well just agree on that so we can all be upfront about it. And it's okay that it's not ideal or the best that you think it could be, but it is the process nonetheless. And somebody new coming into that needs to kind of figure out, okay, am I being invited to optimize this experience? Do I need to work within this experience? And that can kind of set the tone for how much resistance you're going to get from
Mhm.
any process in general, but especially that handoff process, from what their prior expectations would be of that checkpoint.
But I love that bit you just mentioned, the embarrassment, because that is one thing that is always, I would say, the reason why processes are not documented, because they're so patchy in the way things are being done in the build process, the way things are being deployed. It's really, you're putting patches on a broken ship to keep it afloat. And do you think, well, actually, let me take it two steps back. Do you think the onboarding process for a design handover should be communicated from the design team? Because
Hmm.
I have seen development leads try to explain the handover process of designers. And I'm like, why are you doing that? That should be the case
Yeah.
of a designer. And then also the development lead should be talking to designers. This is how we collaborate. This is how we would like the documentation, etc., etc. Have you ever
Yeah.
seen this type of miscommunication from teams you've worked with?
Yeah, I think for me that who's explaining what comes down to the individuals, either on the engineering side or on the design side, who can translate effectively. That's kind of what it comes down to, I think, because it's like I've seen where, maybe a designer tries to explain the handoff process and then they listen, and then a design or a development lead has to go in and say, okay, and then this is what we do with that. Here's how we think about it. Those kinds of things that maybe the designer isn't privy to. Same thing on the other side. I've seen developers kind of walk a designer through their process of maybe like a design review pre-launch, and then a designer go, okay, and then here's how we actually do, and so there's kind of on both sides, I feel like this need to translate of like, okay, here's what we get and here's what we actually do with it. um,
Yeah.
and not saying that it's a bad thing, or sometimes maybe it can cause a bit of friction on the team, but I think that that's actually pretty natural, and if accepted, been like, okay, you know obviously there's going to be more things that each discipline is going to need to do with those sets of information. And so I agree with you, though. I really like the start of that conversation not being one side trampling on the other to say like, this is how we do design handoffs, and it's a dev lead.
Yeah.
or vice versa. Like, this is how we engage with engineering. It's like, yeah, you want to hear that from, like, it gets to the heart of the question that I love, which is, what do you need right now
Yes.
from me? What can I do for you? And so as long as that's the attitude, I don't have like a cut and dry, like every company should be, operating in this order with these people, because it just depends on
Yeah.
everybody's ability to translate between disciplines.
But then you mentioned your last statement, like, you shouldn't expect companies to be XYZ and everything needs to be adapted. I totally get that. But I'll give you something that I experienced actually in a company I was working with. The designers were doing alignment meetings every single day, an
Mm-hmm.
hour alignment meeting every single day. And I was like, why do you need to do that? And they're like, well, we need to update them if we've made a change to the design. And
Wow.
I'm like, I honestly, my eyes were rolling to the back of my head.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying, so I said to them, so you're changing the designs every day, and the development has already started. So you're telling me you haven't frozen the designs, and now you're adding more complexity to the designs every single day. And they said, yeah, that's our culture and our practice.
Wow.
What is your 2 cents on that?
Yeah, that feels a bit wild. I'm not gonna lie. This is wild. But I love that you brought up that example, because like there's this nice area of like what is helpful, and there's a lot of nuance in the space of what is helpful. And maybe for a project that's very, very intense, a situation like that might be okay for a time, but as the normal, that seems very extreme. And
Yeah.
like a breakdown of process, right? It's like, okay, if you have a development team that's working in 2-week sprints, can we agree to give them work that's at least locked in for those 2 weeks, if not for the duration of the initial handoff of the design, if it takes more than a sprint? So creating those agreements of how we work, those how we work statements are really important.
Yes.
um yes, yes, and I saw your eyes light up here, because I want to talk to you about this, like the how we work statements being important.
Yep.
um yeah, to give you an opposite, what I see a lot of times in more development heavy spaces is, designers, I'm all for designers being a part of like a scrum environment as far as it's helpful, but I find that sometimes it leans a little extreme, like in the case that you're talking about, but pretty much the opposite, right? Where it's like every scrum ceremony, designers have to
Yep.
be there, and it's like, okay, but depending on how the organization's divvied up, that could potentially, really creep into, a lot of the time, and it's not always necessary for
Yep.
design to be there. So I see that on both sides, this like weird, sometimes I feel like the meaning of multidisciplinary ends up translating to we all share the same meetings and we're in meetings all the time with each other, versus what are the meaningful checkpoints of what each people actually need from each other to get something done.
I love that. I love that statement because it has been um it's been an agile concept of that T-shaped team aspect, that you should know what the other team members are doing, designers, researchers, vice versa. Designers should know what developers are doing, front end, back end. But it's a waste of time. It really doesn't bring any value. But you just mentioned a key point. Bring in the people that are going to see value in the information and communication to then collaborate with their team members. And I think that's the fix. It's bringing in. You don't want to bring the whole Wu-Tang Clan. You bring just like you just bring the whole. You just bring the specific person who's going to be who needs to know what's going on to then communicate. Now, I'm going to go back to that thing I just mentioned about a designer having to change stuff every day.
Yeah.
Now, it's not a fault on the designer. I also
Mhm.
need to play devil's advocate. Sometimes designers like to freeze stuff, but what happens is product managers start adding
Yes.
in more. There you go.
Yeah,
You already
I
know where I'm
see
going
where
with.
the story's going.
You see where it is,
I've
and
lived
it's
this
all.
story many
I
times.
think I bet you 99.9% of the people listening to this podcast would have experienced this.
Oh,
We
yeah.
finish, yeah, we finish a design, and it's like, hey, we've handed it over. The product manager comes, no, but we need to add in this thing, and it just adds in more complexity. And then again, as the and I've seen this so many times, as the PI or the quarterly goes, more requirements are coming in, more features are coming in to the actual initial feature, and it bloats the scope.
Totally.
Now, so
Yes.
where does the buck lie? I mean,
Yeah.
where does it stop? Does it
Oh my
have?
goodness. Okay, sorry to jump in
Okay,
because
okay.
my
Let's start.
my mind is swimming on this. I
Yeah.
would This is a little bit of a side note, but I've been thinking a lot about this, and I know it's, skewed because I'm in this position more often than any other position, but I can't help but feel the longer that I go on in the design ops field that the designer is uniquely positioned in the middle of everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because they're the middle of the process, right? It's like a request comes from product, design designs, and then hands off to engineering. But guess who always wants to talk? Both.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you get pulled both by product and development, or you set boundaries. And that's kind of where it has to be, right? It's like either you're
Yes.
going to get pulled back and forth by both parties. And, sometimes it's just as simple as like, okay, this is getting crazy. Let's get everybody in a room so we can all talk about it. And that's great. I don't think design, that's one of the boundaries that I have is, if I'm hearing two different things from two different people, those two people, I put a meeting on our calendar and we figure it out instead of me gophering. But it's like it's the simple things like that. But like I've seen that situation of being pulled back and forth
Yeah.
not only bloat the scope, but not know that the scope is being bloated for like
Yeah.
2 weeks, right? Which, depending on the project that you're on, that could be really significant that there was a misunderstanding that went on for 2 weeks that had significant scope impact before it was resolved.
Wow. But I love the statement because I just had, you and Miranda are the
Yes.
ones you and Miranda are the one that run Modus Operandi, and her last episode, it was we mentioned this in the podcast, the ability to set boundaries.
Hmm.
It's a very hard thing for people in our field. Now, I remember she said something which really stuck with me. I actually put it as one of the clips of the trailers. And she mentioned being in this field, in the design field, especially, we have a need, we have this kind of urge to prove our value. So we're
Mm.
always saying yes to everything. Yes, 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 yes. And what we're actually doing is diminishing our value by saying yes and not learning the boundaries of saying no.
Hmm.
Now, you're very experienced, you're well experienced in this field. Now, what advice would you give to people to learn to say no?
Yeah, I think it's a really hard skill to build because most people that manage you really want you to say yes. Whereas like I've noticed in engineering managers typically and it comes from, and this like almost goes back to like really what I've been thinking about a lot. Like engineers have to think very practically, how is this going to get done? And design has a part of that, right? Like as you move closer to implementation, you have to start thinking more tactically. But the problem that I see is like design starts from a place of exploration. There's an idea and then you explore. And being able to cut off that exploring time for an implementation time and being able to flex both parts of your brain of like, okay, right now it doesn't matter how it gets done. I just need to think creatively and then, be hit by reality and, scope it back or whatever needs to happen. Um, but yeah, I think that's kind of one of the problems is like as you go across in design, learning when the exploration phase has ended. And
Yeah.
usually that's when you start saying no to things is and start using product language is what I've ended up doing. I think there's a lot of ways you could approach it. It doesn't have to be that know product language off the cuff, but it's things as simple as, hey, we've moved into a new phase of our project, and
Yeah.
actually getting your surrounding peers to respect phases of design, I think is really important to say, like, we did the exploration, we did, whatever. And if there's new additions, something that I would say is like, hey, we can definitely do a research spike on that, but by doing that spike, we're going to be impacted in this, and this way. And it gives them the option, instead of just giving a flat no, but to say, using impact driven language to say, your request has this impact. Do you want to
Mhm.
proceed? And then formalizing that so that everybody's aware that there's been a shift. Because too often I see there's no shift, and then everybody feels like, what just happened? And everybody's like, no, it's always been this. And it's like, no, that wasn't ever the project scope.
But then, Noel, I always okay. Let me take this question in such a way. There's actually two parts of this question. The first thing is, and I'll speak on some designers I've worked with. A lot of designers
I
tend
must be
not to say.
hungry. I don't know if you heard my belly rumble.
Was
Like the
your
mic
belly?
picked that up. I like lit up. I was like, I haven't eaten breakfast.
Oh, good. Hey,
Sorry.
hey, Noel, I'm keeping that in. I am keeping that in. Oh wow. Oh my god.
uh,
I actually heard it from my microphone as
oh,
well. I thought like
it's like, whoa.
oh god.
Gonna have to
Yeah, I'm
settle with
dead.
some coffee. It's okay.
Do you want to get a quick snack and then you can come back?
No, no,
You
it's good. Let's do it. The coffee will get me through. And I don't feel hungry, but apparently,
yeah,
apparently I
apparently. Oh god. Where was I? You really took me off with that
am. No,
one.
I'm sorry.
Really did.
I'm so disruptive.
No,
You
that's
wanted
totally fine.
to, you wanted to take it back, and
Yeah,
I'm trying to.
okay,
Yeah,
I got it.
okay,
I got
yes.
it. I got it. So, um, a lot of a lot of designers don't say no due to the fact that they don't want to detriment that relationship with product managers because they've built it so much and they've worked hard in building that and they find.
Hmm.
I remember there was this one person, she just couldn't say no to this product manager. So whenever he needed stuff, she would always do it, or she would get her team to do it and literally drop everything and help that person. Now
Hmm.
I'll give her some credit. She done that as a strategic play because she said, I've been working with so many other product managers in this team, but he was somebody that I have built a relationship and built trust.
Hmm.
What's your take on that before I go into the next part of the question?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a tough situation to be in. I mean, to me, a relationship in a business context where you feel like you have to say yes in order, like, all the time to stay in someone's good graces, I would say is a dangerous one, because you are in a position where you have to compromise on your expertise, and that does more damage long term than a short term yes does, in my opinion.
Yeah. That's a brilliant answer. That's an absolute. I would please drop some comments still down below in the description or in the video. We would love to hear what any feedback what Noelle just said because we would love to answer any kind of things that you might be experiencing. I think it's something that me and Noelle are going to be doing on a regular basis. Um, Noelle, I want to move on to the second part of that question.
Yes.
Do you think these product managers have not been taught what an MVP is?
You set me up with that question. That's a good question. Woo. You know,
Oh, take it.
product defines MVP, but you would sometimes wonder about that. You would
It's
sometimes wonder about that definition. It gets really intense sometimes. I feel like, there was one company in particular that I worked with. This is oh my goodness, I love this. They had a unique definition of MVP, and then they had different versions of the MVP, but not like phases, just like depending on who you talk to, it was MVP 1, MVP 2, MVP 3. And
okay.
it was never unified. It was just like when you're working on MVP 1,
Yeah.
do this when you were
Yeah.
because it was like the stakeholders couldn't agree so bad that they had formalized the unideal process, which we talked about.
Yeah.
And they, kudos to them for formalizing it. They just be like, yeah, when you talk to this stakeholder, it's MVP one, when you talk to that stakeholder, it's MVP two.
Yeah.
And we'll label the tickets accordingly, and we'll have 3 different products by the end of it, but whatever. So that was an extreme case, but yeah, it does feel like that sometimes.
No, but I've experienced exactly what you just mentioned.
Mhm.
Exactly. Like you go to speak to one person, different person, different person. They all have a different definition of an MVP. It's the same thing like I did with designers. When I asked them, do you know what tech debt is? And they were like,
Mm,
it's the capacity needed to do the work. And I'm like,
right.
no,
Yeah, I remember that.
tech
That
debt.
was fun.
Yeah, it's like, and one of the key things I came across with an MVP um, is that people don't really operate with the MVP mindset. They operate
Mhm.
with the mindset of the MDP, the most desirable product. You
Yes.
know,
Yes, it's true.
it's
It's true.
it's crazy because it's like, and I'm not gaslighting product managers. I think they are under a lot of pressure, and it's not what that product is minimally viable to do. Like it's
Right.
only meant to do ABC, but they
Yep.
want EDF 1, 2, 3, and that for them is an MDP, which I think the terminology needs to be changed in our culture, in our kind of ways of working. Do you know what I mean? What's your take on that?
Yeah. No, totally. I have a lot of thoughts on this. Not surprisingly. Me having opinions is crazy. But no, but it's so interesting that idea, right? It's like I've just noticed this. It's like with any kind of jargon, the longer that the jargon exists, the less meaning it holds. And then people just say it exactly like tech debt. And like, I don't think anybody should feel dumb for not knowing what that means, because it
Hmm.
probably has meant 5 different things depending on where they've worked, because people just say it meaning a different thing than maybe what it would mean out of a textbook. And so that's part of it. It's like, culturally, what does it mean when we bring up tech debt? That sounds really like a meta conversation. Or what do we mean when we bring up the MVP? And I think that's why you see so many people writing articles and, talking about it, because like, what is the real MVP? And it's like, well, it's because everybody's had like 5,000 different experiences, depending on who they talk to, about what that
Yeah.
definition is. Um, but yeah, I mean, I also have just been struck by, I had a really interesting conversation with a somebody that worked in a infotainment system space.
Okay.
And that was really interesting to me, because he was talking to me about it, and he was kind of saying like, I have a really hard time, when a software designer or a software project manager comes into this space, because the MVP is very important for a infotainment system. It's a physical built-in system.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you have to be really, really critical when you're thinking about what the MVP is for that. And you can't just roll out changes later the
Yeah.
same way you can a website or a, application. Um, and that really stood out to me, where I was like, man, I kind of wish we had more boundary there, right? Because they're looking at it very long term, like years into the
Hmm.
future, of like, what does this MVP have to be for the customer to have a good end experience with this digital but physical product? And I just like was listening to that. I'm like, man, that sounds refreshing, because you really can
Yeah.
hold to this. At the end of the day, this lives here and this has to work this way. Whereas so often with software, it's like, well, they technically can check out, or they technically can, buy this whatever or complete this task, but maybe
Hmm.
this other task over here isn't as good. And it's okay, but we all have to agree on that. And then so often what I find is everybody agrees on it before they've looked at it. And that puts design in a really, in my opinion, kind of horrible spot. Is they have to be the bearers of bad news, because that's when it feels real to the stakeholders, where it's like, well, by executing on these criteria that we've agreed on for months, now you get to
Hmm.
see it. and now you don't like it. And that's usually where the scope blows up and everybody wants the ideal version of it. Or I've seen it blow up on development too, right? Where they see the really, really nice design, but then they can only execute on half of it. And then by the time it's
Yeah.
in production, that's when it gets caught. So I've seen it happen at both of those checkpoints, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, who's
It's
it
a
gets
hard one.
really, yeah, it gets really nebulous of like, where do you define the MVP? Because, you know, sometimes up front, the idea sounds really good. It's like, yeah, sure, we can get away with not having this, this, and this. And then you see it and you're
Yeah.
like, oh crap, that's not gonna work, you know? So there are kind of these spots where, you know, I don't love scope bloat, but I also recognize like, hey, we need to have real conversations throughout this, you know, thing that we're trying to do, this project or a product or a
Hmm.
feature or whatever. Um, but yeah, there has to be those checkpoints to be like, are we still good with
Yeah.
what we're putting out? And if not, you know, then I kind of really try to put it back on the product managers to be like, we have to figure out what's got to give here. Is it budget? Is it the timeline? Is it the
Yeah.
quality? You know, and then
Yeah.
they figure that out, but we really consult with that to say like, here's our POV, our very strong POV, and what we think, what we would propose. You know.
That's, it's weird because I've always been struck by product managers who have brought in features into a product backlog without a DOR. And so audience who don't know what DOR is definition already from an agile perspective, where you know the product spec is in and around, or I would say I like to work 80%. Do you know what I mean? Some people like to
Hmm.
work at 60. I think that's very, very dangerous. But I
Hmm.
like to see if a DOR, if a product spec is at a DOR of 80%, where you know you've got the definitions of what you need. You know, you've probably still have to look into the data schema, and that's still things. That's the 20% where you're a bit unsure.
Hmm.
You need to have that 80% of what is your key feature meant to do? What's the problem? But most of these product managers, I'm hearing, and I've heard some really crazy story. They go in like, "Hey, we've just made this idea the other day." It's like, oh, you know, or they go in like, "Yeah, we've got this idea, but we haven't even spoken to development if our tech stack can deal with this." And it's like, wow, these are. But so this is where it comes down to the question.
Enjoying the content? Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn, TikTok, and Instagram for more updates. Your support helps us bring you even more great content. Now let's get back to our podcast.
Should there be somebody like, should there be a form of governance on your product backlog?
Hmm.
And one, okay, and I can see you're itching to answer this.
No, but I love this. I want to hear the full thing.
Well, number one, should there be a governance on your backlog to be like, have you done? I don't know how they do it in America. In Europe, we're very in tune to using the RICE framework to see if features go into a backlog. Some people use other different frameworks. We tend to use RICE because it's, you know, it doesn't make a big impact. What is your resources needed, etc., etc.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's one thing. Do you think we should be a bit more stringent on a governance framework for ideas to come into a backlog? And two, should there be a lead time before pivot changing? Because there is
Hmm.
always, that's always going to happen.
Right.
Do you know?
Yeah, totally. I love your question about lead time on pivot because I think that is one of the biggest cost fallacies
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
product in, you know, a loving critique of that whole
Yeah.
experience, right? Because they get pulled around too. It's like designers get pulled around, everybody gets pulled around. Product probably most of all has to deal with the most like information to then narrow down most of the time. Lots of opinions, right? And sometimes you find maybe you've listened to the wrong stakeholder and it's like, Mayday, Mayday, I need to switch the project to be in alignment with this other stakeholder that, you know, has a certain expertise on this certain product, whereas maybe, you know, yeah, I don't know, it just depends. But I've seen that happen a lot where it's like, oh crap, we just learned something really important and we do need to pivot. But the cost of pivoting, it's not like, okay, we can just now flip and start working on that, it's like it takes time to shut down or safely switch to something else. And especially in development, that's true. But even in design, you need to be able to think through, especially in the design ops space where you're creating reusable resources for designers to use all across their designs. If something at that scale has changed, you definitely need time to re-educate your consumers to say, hey, we've had a change here. Let me properly explain the change. And here's what you're going to do instead. Like, because it's a shared resource, you can't just pivot the same way you would on maybe a product. And even with the product, there's some pivot time, but I would say the pivot time is definitely extended for a central resource team.
Yeah. I mean, people really don't justify costs on pivoting. And I've really put that down to culture, because pivoting is a very expensive thing to do. You know, I've seen it so many times, and I think what people do, they hide away the numbers of the pivot because it's basically wasted resources, you know?
Yeah, I love that you brought up hiding away the numbers. That's such a good phrase because I feel like, and I would love your take on this, I feel like more and more everybody's had to get better about revealing and hiding numbers. And maybe it's just, that design is culturally growing into being more privy to this information. But it is so interesting. Like, what's your take on, designers utilizing that in a way that's beneficial for, the end goal of the whole team?
It's a hard one. When you, it's a very risky thing to use
Hmm.
numbers. Now, I would suggest that design leaders or directors use numbers. I wouldn't advise, UX designers, senior designers to ever use numbers, because you're playing with fire, in my
Hmm.
opinion. When you
Hmm.
start saying numbers, it causes a reaction, a massive
Hmm.
reaction. Now you got to use it wisely. I would say still, I would advocate to use it, but you have to use it in a wise context. Um, Let me give you my 2 cents with that. So with one company, we literally estimated how much a story point was
Hmm.
for this development team, this product team, etc., etc. Um, and so what we did was we accumulated, or we calculated how much a certain feature would be, and etc. So we had those numbers. Now we would only, and I spoke to other design leaders, is that you would only play those trump cards
Hmm.
if if you know um if you know that it's going to benefit your team in going, or benefit the product in going in a right direction. Do you
Hmm.
know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
you're pulling out trump cards, and you should only use that as and when needed. Now, I'll give you
Hmm.
an example when I used it. So we were talking, so sitting on the top table, we were talking about an idea, and this is where design, we were lucky because design was at a mature stage where we could speak about these sort of things.
Hmm.
And I used this trump card because somebody had an idea, and I swear, I'm not gonna lie to you, he either had it in the shower or he had it when he was just walking towards work, because
Hmm.
he had already defined his product backlog. And we had noticed that he'd done this before. He had done this mistake before, where he had
Hmm.
spent near enough $250,000 and only one
Hmm.
person used that feature.
Yeah.
Now, our idea had been researched, it had been backed up with data, we had tested it, we had verified it, we pitched it into the backlog, we pitched it into the VP. They were
Hmm.
totally behind it, but because that one had more influence than say, he kind of went over our behind our backs to try and
Hmm.
get his idea, and that's when we played that trump card. Not great, not a good
Right.
thing, but when you go to that top table, you have to play some form of politics behind it. Now, if you have
Hmm.
that sort of data and numbers, you can really bring it out. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I
very
love that
dangerous.
you brought out this story and that you have that take of it being a rare occurrence, because I do see a lot more and more, like, this idea of designers being at the table. And I personally am pro designers being at the table, but I agree with you that there's a high risk to it.
Hmm.
And it's this thing of like, yeah, I love what you said about like numbers have a reaction. And I think that's why designers are more and more leaning into that, because they're used to never being listened to, and so they kind of need that trump card as an entry point to being listened to, of like, no, we have valuable data, we actually do cost analysis. I think
Yeah.
sometimes design isn't taken seriously until they play a card like that. I
Hmm.
do think there's ways to use numbers though to maybe scale it back. Like, it's not the end all be all, but it's something that you're regularly tracking and actually just bringing up to product on a regular basis, not for a strategic point as far as like
No.
getting, what you uh want is kind of a weird word, but it's like, and I always go back to this. Everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants
Yeah.
like the end user to have a good time, to do the thing, and
Yeah.
make the company money. Basically,
Yeah.
like that's the end goal. Everybody wants that. So I never really see it as like totally pitted against each other. It's like, let's all bring the most valuable information that we have to get this done. But yeah, like there are totally intense situations like you're describing where it's like, yeah, you really have to strategically
Hmm.
shut something down and do that very carefully and cautiously. And it's usually not great, but sometimes it has to happen. Um
Yeah. That's
yeah.
it. It's a hard one because you know it's as you mentioned, numbers do speak and everything, and yeah, I'm all for designers come to our table, but you know if you and I'll give my advice to any designer coming to the top table: do not speak about UX. If you're going on the top table, don't ever speak any UX jargon. You have to speak business language. And I
Yeah.
find that with business language, it's more the case that what features and what things are going to bring the most return of investment, the best value and best impact. And yeah, I think if you have that data behind you, it speaks words. If you say, hey, and I said the extreme point, but there is that good point that you just mentioned. Say, hey, we got this feature, we have done, our assumption is we are going to hit these numbers and go like XYZ. And I think that's the thing about the top table. No one has a definite answer. No, it's everyone is in that assumption phase, just like a designer. They're
Hmm.
hoping their feature is going to hit the numbers and
Right.
give them their bonus. So
Right. Well,
yeah.
and it's also, the more you engage with it, the more you realize that the numbers are squishy. And I
Yep.
think this kind of gets back to like what kind of inspired this topic, of like, everybody is trying to get what they want, but it goes back to like, okay, but does what we want actually make a good product or a good experience or benefit the business?
But that's the thing, isn't it? It comes down to the question, like, are product managers and are we in this culture of product managers trying to keep their head above water just by small gains?
Right.
Or,
Hmm.
they're just
Yeah.
basically, let me paint the picture to the audience. Like, are we breeding a culture of product managers saying, hey, I've just made this feature, I'm hitting my numbers, my the target is off my head for the end of this year, or my bonus is going to be
Hmm.
looking great? Or, you know, are
Right.
we not are we not breeding a product culture where they're looking at the long gains?
Right.
You know, it
Yeah.
comes down to that question of culture, as you just
Yes.
mentioned in the business. So
And I love that. And that's kind of why I wanted to bring up numbers a little bit, because I do find like whether or not you're at the top table, you are going to have to be interfacing with product back and forth as a designer. And that's healthy. And I think there's healthy banter in design, having numbers at the ready to either confirm or contrast the proposal that product has, versus kind of what we were talking about. It's like, do you have the ability to say no is one thing, but do you have data to back up why you might say no? That's where
yes,
you're going to have issues. It's like, well, a product leader or a product manager isn't going to care if the answer is, hey, I don't think it's a good idea. Why don't you think it's a good idea? Have you seen that it's not a good idea? What do you know? And depending on your relationship with the product manager, and I can understand kind of that story you were talking about, like once you have a good relationship with a product manager, it's really nice because sometimes you don't need the numbers, right? But when you're first
yeah,
establishing that relationship, I feel like it's really important to show like, hey, when this person speaks, it's because they've done their research. It's because they know the product. It's because they
Mhm.
know our customers or whatever it is. And then you don't have to talk about numbers as much. But when it gets into those, banters about, is this a good idea or is it not a good idea? Yeah, I feel like you kind of have to have that ready.
Yeah. But I love that you brought that one up because a lot I have seen, and I'm probably going to get a lot of backlash from this, but I have seen a lot of design leaders fail in getting those numbers due to the fact they
Mm,
struggle to let go of the design aspect of their role. They
mm,
were the UX designer, they were the senior UX
yeah.
designer, and it's like, hey, I now need to leave something of something that's creative to now look at numbers on a spreadsheet and data. And that's why I think there's a massive gap in understanding the business and also the ability to say no because they struggle to transition from.
Yeah, that opens a whole can of worms, and I'm gonna try to not open the full can, but peel the lid back a little bit. Uh, I totally agree with that, and I think part of it is like the weird career progression that's kind of come about just like corporate life is that split between do you go towards principal or do you go to manager? And there's that fork in the road, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people, just, you know, pay more for the management route. And so a lot of
Mhm.
people are, like, oh, hey, well, I'm at this point in my career. I could either make this much or this much, and maybe go with that and then have a hard time because, maybe principal is really what they wanted. But now they
Yeah.
have these managerial responsibilities, which is like more people stuff and more tracking than it is doing the work and becoming that like rich subject matter expert.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I do think about that a lot, and I wonder if that's part of the struggle behind that gap that you're talking about is yeah maybe people getting into management and kind of missing the work.
But then it ties into our last episode on Modus Operandi. I think we're having to move into the strategic aspect within
Yeah.
our career. I think it's an I think we have no option to do
hmm
so. You know, what's your take?
Yeah, I love what we were talking about just before this, and I think it ties in really well. There's always a need for people thinking about the long game versus just the short gains. I think it's important to be able to act upon the short gains, but I think it's really important to be able to speak up and be an expert on, hey, we can do this, but long term, this needs to happen, or this level of quality is below what we should be striving for. And being able to have a threshold for the level of quality of a product, but be understanding when it has to give a little bit. There's always going to be a need for people in that kind of role. Whether or not it looks more like, hey, we're tracking things now versus actually, pushing pixels around on a screen. Um, you're right, there's probably going to be some changes in the future to how much one or the other happens. But that thinking role, that more strategic role of what's good in this situation is
Yeah.
always, with a certain lens of design, I think is always going to need to be there. And, I think that humans will always appreciate that human touch here and there. I think,
Yeah.
overall, there's more things that will be, automated, but users know the human touch and appreciate it all the same.
But then, Noel, I'm going to ask you a very provocative question.
Ooh, I'm excited.
You excited? Are you ready? Are you
I'm
ready?
hyped. I'm ready. Maybe we'll find out.
Me and you have been in this industry for a while. Um, why the hell is is UX not a product?
mm. I wanna ask what you mean by that. Like, from what angle is UX like not? Yeah, I want to
Well,
hear more.
so if you ever worked in an application, there might be certain streams or verticals
hmm
of that application.
Yeah.
So it's a certain product or but I've never understood why there's never been a dedicated stream for just UX,
Mm.
or okay, how can no let me put it in a better way, in a better terminology. Let's call it common experience.
Mm,
You know,
mhm.
why has there never been a dedicated product team to fixing UI issues, to enhance? I mean, yes, you know, think about like a design system. A
Mhm.
design system goes across all the verticals,
Right.
isn't it?
Yeah.
But then why have businesses never thought about a horizontal product team dedicated towards the experience and, you know, just the user experience from your perspective?
Mm. Yeah, I don't know. I would say like there's definitely been dedicated UX departments. There's definitely been dedicated like UX teams that would do that. And oftentimes I see sometimes that's split on like an innovation team, right? Like there's always the innovation team that's pushing forward, but then maybe there's a branch of the innovation team that looks at what we have and then asks,
Yeah,
how can we improve it?
yeah.
But I think what you're talking about is a bit different. It's a bit more tactical, right?
Yes. Like, because it ties into that last comment that we just mentioned about
Hmm.
we should be now moving in more into strategic. We should be like now properly on the top table. So then why have companies not seen this aspect of UX being its own product in its sense?
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like design systems have just now really been addressed as a need. It's
Hmm.
like everybody's kind of had secret design system teams, and now business leaders are engaging with it and hiring for it. Like, I would even say, like, the job titles is a really good way of tracking kind of when design systems finally made sense from a business perspective because you used to just kind of get like product designer. You'll be working on, maybe like some centralized resources here and there. You might be working on other things, whatever.
Mm,
But then there was this shift in job descriptions of like design systems designer or
yeah.
design ops designer. And like it was like, okay, the business is recognizing that this is a fully dedicated role on a fully dedicated team. And I would say what you're describing is almost a step more in that
Yes.
direction. And I almost
Yeah.
wonder that it's inevitable that that would happen. And maybe it already is happening kind of the same way that design systems were happening and just, and I think a lot of design system teams end up trying to do that anyway because they do have that visibility into all the products. If they're engaging with their consumers to see how they're using things and then they get to see those commonalities and
Yeah.
distinctions. And so I think in a lot of ways, design system teams wish they had capacity to do it because they see the need for it. But truly, I think it's kind of and this is one take on it. I think there's probably a lot of reasons, but one take goes back to what we were talking about of like these siloed feature proposals
Yeah.
kind of dominating how we work in software. Where it's like, okay, this person has an idea, this team is dedicated to that idea, this team is this idea, blah, 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 blah. But nobody's really, other than the top is really thinking about the whole picture. And there's this need for not only people up here thinking about it, but people who actually understand the the groundwork of it, then communicating back up to the top. And then those two resources being able to, create some kind of structure, some kind of communication to say, okay, like this is the direction that the company wants to go. Here's what's
Yeah.
happening across all the products. Here's, that. And I think product should be that in a lot of cases, but you're right, like the UX expertise in that is so important to be able to think about that experience more holistically. And I've seen product managers that have a UX background do that really well, but that's not
Yes.
always the case.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen product managers who came from UX
Hmm.
to really implement that strategy as you just mentioned. And I think that's where I'm really trying to pinpoint. I think we've been hidden too deep down. I mean, before we used to be hidden underneath development. You know,
Yeah.
in my days, it used to be UX and development, and
Hmm.
then as time went on, we moved towards the service side of the
Hmm.
business. Sorry, and in product designer now, we're starting to move up. But I've spoken to many people in large companies where they have a CDO, and they even have a director of UX, but they're still away from the product's kind of strategy on the user experience. They're
Hmm.
still, hey, this is the culture, this is a strategy that we want for UX, but it's hard to implement them on multiple different products across an enterprise solution due to the fact that you know, UX is still not a product inside of
Right.
those little product streams. Do you know what I mean? And I think,
Yeah.
I personally think that, if you bring UX, I don't want to use the word design thinking because I think that's kind of lost now. And I
Yeah.
think,
Going back to jargon that's been used for a long time.
yeah, yeah, jargon has been used, you know, but I think if you bring that design principles to the top
Mhm.
level, and I'm talking CPO level, VP level, that's where I personally believe UX or design principles should be positioned. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind, and this isn't, this is just where my mind goes, is like prove it. You know what I mean? It's like I agree, but I think there's a big need to prove it because like who wants to talk to the C-suite? Everyone.
Yeah.
And they have to block people out, like they have to trust that that part of the business will handle that part of the business, and they don't need to know about it, or be reminded of it every day or have a certain frequency with it, right? Like they get a report and that's good. So I guess my first thought is like, okay, if we truly believe that that's where it needs to go, then there needs to be a very high level of proof that that needs to get to that person. And of course, that depends on the size of the company and the organization, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe it makes sense to have your C-suite sitting in the room with you pretty often, but for very large companies, you're really going to need to express why that's important and have a lot of data and ideas on how to back that up, because
Yeah.
it's a big pitch,
Yeah.
but I think you're right that it would serve the company very well. I would also say it probably depends on the organization,
Mhm.
and I love that answer, but I'll break it down a little bit. I think it really makes the most sense in which where technology is really driving revenue. If the
Okay.
technology is not driving revenue at the company, um, and is more of a efficiency gain, like how does the company overall make more
Yeah.
money, right? And I've
Yeah.
thought about this like in terms of like an like just like different industries, right? You can have um like I'll give the example of like a credit card company, right? They make
Yeah.
money off of the credit cards. They don't make money off of the credit card website. That's how people pay
Hmm.
their bills. It's very necessary, very integral. But does the C-suite really have an interest in all of the optimization that could happen? Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe,
Yeah.
but how frequently? Whereas something that's a SaaS product and they are selling a digital product, they should be very interested in what their
Yeah.
UX team has to say, right?
Wow.
So I think it kind of depends.
Wow. I love that answer. That's a brilliant answer. It really does that come down to, because it's, as you mentioned, that's a really good example that you brought there. The credit card company. It's not about the interface of the mobile app. That's not where the money is, and that's where the culture will not be focused, or the business strategy will not be focused on. And I think that's a lot of frustration for designers. You know, it really does come down to, well, am I working in something that's really getting a lot of attention from the C-suite? Do you know what I mean? I love that. That's such a great answer, Noelle.
Totally. And
Honestly.
honestly, like that's really good advice for people that are feeling unfulfilled. Like if they want something more intense where design is really driving something, then find the company that makes money off of good design, Then
Yeah.
they'll care.
Yeah.
Then you'll be in the fire,
Yeah. Ah, that's such a brilliant answer, Noelle. I think, a lot of us have joined large corporate enterprises expecting their applications or websites that they're working on to be
Hmm.
the one that's, but then it's, as you just mentioned, if the C-suite level does not see value in that application or in that software, or et
Hmm.
cetera, then you won't get the benefits of pushing your creativity to the point of you being satisfied.
Yeah, and I see
Wow.
this all the time on internal products too, right? Like anybody that's ever worked on an internal facing like digital product has been met with most likely the answer of, "Oh, it's okay that the experience isn't ideal. We have a training budget. We'll train them how to use it."
Yeah.
And so like that's a really really on the opposite extreme of like like, and this sounds really blunt, but this is just, maybe somebody needs to hear this. The C-suite doesn't care about the user interface of the internal product. They don't. They care about the outcome that the internal product gets. And as long as the outcome is available in a way that, you know, like they might start to care if people, if the software is so bad that people are quitting at really high rates. That would be something that would catch their attention. But otherwise, as long as the mechanism works, the efficiency gains that maybe a really ambitious designer would want to push for an internal product, it's probably not going to be given the budget to do that because that's not going to make the money, although it would greatly improve, you know, some quality of life things.
Wow. Wow. Absolutely amazing. It's so funny. Do you see how we started this podcast? We started
Right?
it all the way from the bottom level,
We have
talking
gone
about
through.
literally we started about handovers and we
Yes.
literally worked our way all the way up to the C-suite. That's amazing. We didn't even get a chance to answer my question.
That's true. We didn't even get to part 2, but you know,
No, we didn't.
luckily there's always a part 2.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Noelle is here on a regular basis on the Modus Operandi. She is the main star of this, so we will definitely bring up that next question for another podcast. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. Keep them on the edge of their seat. We're not going to tell you what the question is.
Yeah. You know, drop some comments. Please drop some
Yeah.
comments in below. If you really want to know what the next topic's about,
That's right.
you can see me and Noelle just go on a tangent when it comes down to talking to each other. So
Yeah, I would love to do a Q&A session. So if you have questions, I would love to see
yes.
them. And
Oh,
even if you have advice too that you want to drop, I would love to even like react to y'all's advice that you would give about these different topics.
brilliant. Please, I will put Noelle's LinkedIn profile on the show notes. Again, please drop some comments there. Message her if you want. If there's anything that resonates with you from today's show, we would really love to hear your comments and really love to hear your questions. And that will be coming up, and we'll try and answer them. We will try and answer them as soon as we can. And yeah. I'm looking forward. I'm really looking forward to when they release this episode. So
Yeah. Amazing. Me
nice one.
too.
Thank you, Noelle, and I will see you back on the next show.
All right. See y'all.